Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with me today are two of my colleagues from my Senate office, Mr. John Lowry and Mr. Jackson Bewley. I am grateful for their good judgment, counsel, and advice. I am delighted, Mr. President, to see so many members of Congress, and I mean this sincerely, so many members of Congress embrace the call for a less wasteful federal government, for a more efficient federal government. We spend a little over $6 trillion a year, as Senator Sanders so eloquently pointed out. When you spend $6 trillion a year, somebody's getting $6 trillion a year. Every penny in our budget has a constituency, and that constituency will fight us. They will fight us. And I recognize that, and it's something that as we go about downsizing government, we have to be mindful of. However, there is one constituency that is not going to be able to fight us in our quest to scrutinize federal spending, and I'm referring to dead people. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about dead people and the fact that they're getting money from the federal government. In fiscal year 2023 alone, this is just 1 year, our government sent $1.3 billion, not $1.3 million. We sent $1.3 billion in checks to dead people. Those aren't my numbers. Those numbers come from the Office of Management and Budget. That's just 1 year. Not only is the federal government sending checks to dead people, those checks are being cashed. Now, I have heard, Mr. President, of dead people voting, but cashing the checks? You don't have to be God's perfect idiot to realize that there's fraud happening with respect to all this money. Here's how this problem arises. When you die in America, your name is sent to the Vital Records Office in your state. And at that point, the Social Security Administration pays each state to get an ongoing list of deceased Americans in that state. So far, so good. The Social Security Administration takes this data, this list of deceased people, and they compile on an ongoing basis a list called the Death Master File. The Death Master File. That's just a list of everybody, updated daily, of people in the United States who are deceased. Why does the Social Security Administration do this? Well, so the SSA, Social Security Administration, can stop sending people who have died checks. So far, so good. There's just one problem. I discovered this about 7 years ago. The Social Security Administration refuses to share that list with anybody else in the federal government. They won't share it with any other federal agencies, many of which send out checks. The Department of Treasury, for example, sends out checks SSA won't share the information with them. The Small Business Administration sends out a lot of checks. The Social Security Administration has a list of all deceased Americans, but SSA will not share that information with the SBA. I'll give you some examples. You remember, Mr. President, when we were in the coronavirus crisis, so we had an economic meltdown. We sent stimulus checks to Americans to try to keep the economy on its feet. We paid $1.4 billion to dead people, and they cashed the checks. The Paycheck Protection Program, which was a part of our stimulus program, paid out $38 million alone to dead people. These were people who were using, live people obviously, who were using dead people's Social Security numbers to collect payments. The COVID-19 Economic Disaster Injury Disaster Loan Fund, another culprit, was involved in sending checks to dead people. The Department of Veterans Affairs, and I'm not blaming them, in many respects it's not their fault. A couple of years ago, a scam artist stole the Social Security number of a deceased person, deceased veteran, and received about $825,000 in checks from 1997 to 2024. Now, the person committing this fraud was just quietly accepting the checks. Somehow the Department of Veterans Affairs, and for some reason, stopped sending that person the checks. So the fraudster just picked up the phone and called the Department of Veterans Affairs. He impersonated the dead person and convinced them to start sending the checks again. Again, not necessarily the fault of the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA didn't know that the Social Security number belonged to a deceased person. Another example, a person in Ohio was able to collect her deceased mother's Veterans Affairs benefits for 48 years. 48 years before she was called. The truth is, Mr. President, it's sort of like saying, being asked, you didn't go fishing on Saturday. How many fish do you think you didn't catch? We don't know how much money we're sending out every year to dead people. Let me give you an example of how screwed up the data is, Mr. President. This is a strong indicator of what's wrong. The Social Security Administration, if you ask them, will tell you that there are, according to their records, there are 6.5 million Americans living today in America who are 112 years of age or older. They say there are 6.5 million Americans who are at least 112 years old or older. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. President, but I don't know anybody who's 112 years old. And I checked, at any given time, there are about 40 people on an ongoing basis in the world who are fortunate enough to live to be 112. But the data is so screwed up that according to SSA, 6.5 million people are 112 years old. A number of years ago, 7 years ago, I started working with Senator Tom Carper, a fine American, if there ever was one. I started working with Tom on this issue. I went to Social Security, and I said, look, this problem is easily solved. Just share the death master file with other agencies, and especially share it with the Department of Treasury. I don't want to confuse anyone, but the Department of Treasury has a do not pay list of people who aren't supposed to receive checks for a variety of reasons that other agencies consult. But I said to my friends at Social Security, why don't you just give the death master file to other agencies? They said, we can't. It's illegal. The way we construe our enabling statutes, we don't have the authority. Well, I said, okay, I'm not going to argue with them. We'll just go pass a law. It was harder than I thought, but we did. In 2020, Senator Carpenter and I passed a bill. The bill was called Stopping Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. And it gave the Social Security Administration permission, and indeed directed the Social Security Administration to start sharing its list of dead people with other agencies in the federal government. I don't want to get down in the weeds, but believe it or not, we had people oppose the legislation. And many people within the federal government. So in order to get our bill passed, we had to compromise. We had to agree to only implement this requirement that Social Security share the list of dead people with everybody else. We could only get them to agree to do it for 3 years for a trial program. This clock started ticking on our 3-year period in December of 2023. So obviously, 3 years is right upon us, and if we don't make this program permanent, it's going to expire in 2026. So Senator Carpenter and I have introduced another bill. It does basically the same thing as the 2020 bill, but it makes the program permanent. This new bill is called Ending Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. And we need to pass it. There's been a lot of squabbling back and forth. I don't want to do anything to step on too many toes to jeopardize my bill, but about how much the states are going to be paid and who's going to pay Social Security for sharing their dead person's list with the rest of the government. I think we have a lot of it worked out, but we need to go pass this bill. I mean, this makes no sense whatsoever. I can understand if we talk about changing the Medicaid program, for example. What's fair, what's unfair. I can understand debating that, and I can understand reasonable people disagreeing over what changes, if any, we ought to make to the Medicaid program. I get it. I just listened to Senator Sanders once again speak very eloquently about the waste at the Department of Defense. That's something that reasonable people, all of whom agree that we ought to have a strong defense, but reasonable people can disagree over how to achieve that. But my God, you don't have to be Euclid to figure out that this is just fraud. It's abuse. It's low-hanging fruit, and it's so easily solved. All we have to do is direct the Social Security Administration on a permanent basis, not a 3-year trial basis, on a permanent basis, to start sharing the list of dead people with the Department of Treasury and everybody else in federal government who wants it. And then everybody's on the same page, and we know who's deceased, and we can stop sending the money to dead people who cash the checks. Now, I'm talking about this now, Mr. President. I've talked about it before on the floor. I'm not going to try to pass the bill this year. I'm not. We're running up against the clock, and we have the NDAA. We have a CR to pass, and we've got to keep government open. We've got to renew the flood insurance program, and you know all that, Mr. President. But I'm going to be back. I'm like the Terminator. I will be back as soon as the new Congress is sworn in. Many of my colleagues have said to me, you know, it's time we stop talking about who needs to pay more in taxes and start talking about and asking the question with respect to what the hell happened to the money. And I agree with them. I can't think of an easier place to start. Let's just pass this simple bill. Let's stop sending money to dead people. Again, we can debate about the wisdom of dead people voting. We all know what happens. But cashing checks, that's a bridge too far. Thank you, Mr. President, for your time and attention. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Ball.